Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar. I'm Rebecca Sliz. I'm the Senior Product Marketing Manager at Imprivata for our Patient Secure product, and I am going to be the host of today's webinar. Just a couple housekeeping things, and then we'll get right into the discussion. So today's webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording in a couple days that you can listen to again or share with your colleagues. If you have a question, please use the Q&A box in the upper right corner of your screen to submit a question at any time during the webinar. We'll get to as many questions as we can, and if we don't get to your particular question, we will follow up afterwards. All right, now we're ready to get into our discussion. So I'm happy to be online today with two of our clinical workflow specialists, Chris McKay and Claire Riley. Both of them have nursing experience, significant experience in the field that they will be able to share today, along with observations from their experience as clinical workflow specialists for Imprivata. Today's topic is clinical consequences of patient misidentification. So to get into that, I'm going to just refer to this statistic that we often see with respect to patient misidentification, that 7 to 10% of patients are misidentified when their medical record is accessed or when they present for care. So, Chris, I'm going to start with you and ask, when you think about this statistic, does this seem believable to you based on your experience, and tell us a little bit about how this misidentification can happen.
Sure. Thank you very much for having us today. And I want to say that 7 to 10% is actually a very strong number. That's very accurate. That actually came from a Poneman study, if I'm not mistaken. And I want to be clear. I mean, 7 to 10% have this medical record, have this percentage problem. It doesn't always end up in a catastrophic event. But a misidentification could be something simple as someone getting, placed in the hallway by the wrong armband, to getting a wrong X-ray, or worst case scenarios, having some, surgical procedure taking place. So, that could end up, having, the wrong kidney taken out or a limb taken off. These are the very extreme cases. But if 7 to 10% is a variable that you can live with, that's kind of alarming to me. So I know it's real and it's out there. So it's something that we're tackling every day. Claire, would you say the numbers is pretty spot on, or?
Yes, I think it's a real number that we know about. And before I go on, good afternoon, everybody. Good day, good evening around the world. And thank you for inviting us to share this useful solution and information with you. I think the number is true, Chris, but I think these are numbers that are identified. And I think we mustn't forget the number of patients that are potentially misidentified that we are unaware of, that go through their patient journey, through the facility, through the front door, out the back door, or elevated up into an admission status. And they may have been misidentified. We may have the fortune of catching it as they pass through their journey. We may not have the fortune of catching it. It may get caught in the back office. It may never get caught. So that's the abyss of the unidentified, which is a more concerning alarm, and the inability to measure that makes this number very, very real. So we have to be very mindful of that and thoughtful of that unknown.
You're absolutely right. Actually, one of the hospitals that just approached us for the solution and know they have a real problem had a patient admitted, stayed on the floor for 3 weeks, discharged, and when it got to the medical records department, it was caught. This patient experienced complete care under someone else's identity, medication list, and luckily nothing happened to the patient, but it's real.
Thanks, Chris and Claire. That's an important way to start in terms of just identifying the problem and talking about the scope of the known problem, as well as Claire referred to as what we don't even know is happening. Let's talk a little bit more about why patient identification can be so difficult. So this example that hopefully all of you can see right now is from Harris Health System down in Houston. And this example has been used a bit, so you may be familiar with it, and that is about Maria Garcia. So within the Harris Health database, which covers about 3.5 million patients, if you go all the way down the funnel there are about 231 Maria Garcias that have the same name and date of birth. So these two pieces of information that are often used to identify people, name and date of birth, clearly don't get you to the single patient that is standing in front of you. So this is an example that may or may not be familiar, but I'd like to hear from you guys now about some of the other reasons why identifying patients can be so difficult. Chris, I'll start with you again.
Sure. I think that's again, when you look at the number, it's alarming that you can have that many folks with the same name, date of birth. But it's even more challenge for the registration folks up front who see 230 Maria Garcias or 231 Maria Garcias, and they don't want to create that error. They don't want to make a mistake. So what do? They give you a blank chart, and then we create a number 232 Maria Garcia. And from a clinician standpoint, that's a safety concern. I mean, they think they're doing the right thing, but, I have no medical history on this patient anymore. I have no, any allergies they had, any surgeries they had, all go away when they just start a new slate. So it's a concern from a safety standpoint, and certainly, again, it's not malicious, but it's if you can tie a biometric to somebody and actually bring that into play. And it doesn't have to be Maria Garcia. I live in Boston. There's more Sean Kellys or in the UK, John Smiths in the world. It's not an ethnic thing. It's the fact that if there's more than one, if it's Christopher McKay or Christopher J. McKay or Chris McKay, they don't want to put the wrong chart in. So they tried to do the right thing in their eyes and create another 232 Chris McKay. And that's not really helping. So I think it's a real problem. That's where it starts. And from the clinician standpoint, we're just looking to get them into the system, so we're hurrying them through. And you can see some downstream problems, Claire, when we just kind of pull them through and not get the right chart. Correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And just for the audience, this statistic, as alarming as it sounds, is actually true. This is one of my customers. So this is a very real stat. And to Chris's point, it's not just related to culture, ethnicity. Those names are repeated around the world, and there are more and more in pockets around the world. So it is a real, true problem. Why do people get misidentified? Many behaviors. Human behavior, wherever we put a human, there is always room for error. That's a well-known fact in any action that we may carry out. People don't have health insurance, so they're going to be fraudulent for right or wrong reasons, but that is a reason. We have drug-seeking behavior out there. We have undocumented people around the world, and the list goes on. So there are many reasons of this collecting the data from the wrong person, the patient that's not in front of you. And the downstream effect of that is huge, as Chris alluded to, the potential of allergies that we don't know about, patients' medical history that we don't know about, any relevance to previous visits within the last 24, 48 hours, any hospital admissions, many downstream catastrophes that potentially can lead to patient harm. And of course, the main purpose of this is to drive home patient safety and make sure that we get the right patient at the right time for the right visit and the right treatment to be carried out.
Yeah, and Claire, as you were talking, I flipped to the next slide because you started to get into just the examples and the topic of this slide, which is, so we have this misidentification caused by a human interaction and people trying to communicate. Sometimes there's language barriers, sometimes there's hearing issues, you have registration staff that's under pressure. So, a lot of legitimate reasons why misidentification occurs, and then a number of downstream effects. So you both have touched a little bit on patient harm and some of the examples of harm that can be done. This slide also shows a couple other areas that may be impacted by misidentification, including revenue, a hospital or a health system's revenue, and patient satisfaction. So I wonder, Claire, if you wouldn't mind commenting a little bit more about some of these other downstream effects from a patient safety or a patient satisfaction or a revenue perspective as well.
Sure, and I touched on a couple of minutes ago getting the right patient at the right time for the right visit and the right treatment. Chris alluded earlier to the back office, and if we don't have the right patient billing in the back office, it cannot be carried out. These visits cannot be billed for, or they may well be billed, but then they'll arrive in the insurer's hands, and they'll probably catch it wasn't that patient, it was the wrong patient, it was the brother, it was that patient's probably already inpatient. So there's many other catches that happen once the patient is out of the healthcare facility per se, and then insurance companies are not paying, and there are hundreds of thousands into millions of dollars every year that are lost in revenue through insurers not paying because it's the wrong patient that's actually had that health care. The unhappy patients, so there's a lot of internal work that goes on and that legally has to be carried out when a patient is misidentified, which I'm sure all of you on this call are aware of. There has to be the trickle-down effect of who gets informed. If you start putting laboratory results, radiology results into the wrong patient, then we have another problem. If that gets caught, and this has happened along the way, then we have to call the patient who those results have landed in their chart. That leads to a huge dissatisfaction, and more importantly, to Chris and I's side of the arm on the clinical side, that leads to patients mistrusting when they come in again, and that relationship starts breaking down that they have with their healthcare providers. So it really is multifaceted, this misidentification of patients. Chris, did I miss anything there?
No, you touched on it all. I think that the unsatisfied patient, whether it be because we have to call them because we put the wrong information in the chart, and that's just an obligation we have both morally and ethically. That trust is huge, and if you lose that from the get-go, you're not gonna gain that back very easily. That's something that they're very much aware of, and this is where they come to get taken care of, and making sure that their healthcare system, their physician, their nurses are the ones they entrust with it. So if you break that, it's a tough road to get that back.
Very true. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about the patient safety implications, since you are both clinicians by background and in current practice. And one of the reasons that I shared this slide is because I think we've found that stories can move people sometimes even more than statistics around patient safety. And that's partly because some stats around patient safety are a little hard to come by. Hospitals don't necessarily want to report all of these incidents for the reasons that you guys were just talking about. It's a very much a trust issue. Obviously, when they have to report, they do, but it's often in the headlines that we see examples like the one on the screen where a cancer treatment, in this case, was given to the wrong patient. So just on that point of stories, you shared a couple already. I was just wondering if there are any other stories that come to your minds when you think about misidentification and what kind of an impact it had from a patient safety perspective. And you have given a couple examples already, but if there are any other that stick out in your minds. And Chris, do you have one?
Sure, yeah. As I mentioned when I first started with that percentage slide, 7 to 10%, it can be as simple as just misidentifying them and putting the wrong name band on them. And of course, it can happen anywhere during that chain. Again, I'm not blaming registration, I'm not blaming nurses. It's not a blame game. It's a safety issue. So that person who's got the wrong band on, they come back and transport just says, I'm here to take you for a chest x-ray. Are you John Smith? And they're like, yes, I am. Unfortunately, they didn't know that this person's, alert but demented. So you could have asked him if he was Abraham Lincoln, and he would be, yes, I am. So here he is going for a chest x-ray, and he's there for a flu shot. And, now he gets radiation. Now, is a chest x-ray going to kill someone? No. Was it an error that has to be reported? Yes. And again, now, because he's not of sound mind, you need to contact the next of kin. Sorry, we irradiated your father or your loved one, a spouse, or that's a huge, again, dissatisfier across the board. I know that I mentioned the one from that hospital that had him inpatient for 3 months. There's been some horrific ones. I mean, and typically you do see it when it's a sentinel-like event. We've had one that's had the wrong kidney removed because they took the name on the CT and they didn't check against the biometric. They did pull up the kidney that had a tumor on it, so they took out that right kidney. Unfortunately, that was not the right x-ray, and the person indeed had a tumor, but it was on the other kidney, and they took out the healthy kidney. So now this person is doomed for dialysis. So, I mean, there's some catastrophic events that can come of this. That's why the implications are so widespread. It could be something as little as being left in the hallway or getting the wrong x-ray to, again, having the wrong kidney removed.
Claire, do you have any particular stories that come to your mind?
I mean, being an emergency room nurse for many years, there are multiple stories that Chris mentioned earlier that don't have these catastrophic events that you're looking at on the screen right now. But that doesn't mean to say that it's not a relevant, important event for that patient and their loved one. Even giving the wrong patient Tylenol, if they're allergic to Tylenol, and there are multiple misses that do not have catastrophic outcomes. You talked about, this one obviously reaching the media. When this reaches the media, this is often 2 and 3 years after the fact. There's legal ramifications involved there, so we don't know until downstream. And in those 2 to 3 years, there are multiple misidentifications going on that aren't as large as this, but to that patient, they are large. They're not as catastrophic as this, but to be the wrong patient, the wrong treatment, and misidentified is very, very painful to patients when they come in trusting in the healthcare environment. So there are many stories, Rebecca, and they happen every minute of every day through the healthcare system. But this one obviously is huge, and had there been a palm scan at point of care here, this would have been avoided without a shadow of a doubt.
You hit on a great topic there. The point of care for me is something that our customers, our hospitals, realize that it's really important to put there, and places that have it at a very high risk area, like again, CyberKnife, or before you get into an accelerator and receive high doses of treatment, and at the right place and the right person is so important, because that could be, again, that high risk. And insurances see that as something that hospitals are taking and doing the right thing for the patient. And having a point of care biometric at that point is just so much the right thing to do for the patient, the hospital. Again, in insurance sees that, and oftentimes will give you discounts along those lines. Again, I'm not an insurance sales guy, but I tell you this, that it makes so much sense to me from a safety standpoint, from a nursing standpoint. These people don't look like the same people when they start a radiation treatment or a cancer treatment. There's no picture that's going to say, oh, yeah, this is definitely the person, or a name band that you could identify them. Biometrics don't change. So knowing that you can 100% guarantee that the patient you're going to give a lethal dose of medicine or radiation to is the right patient, and you're giving the right dose and the right area of treatment, that's again, the safety that you can't pass up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And if I can just add on to that, Chris, touching on point of care there. Sorry, Rebecca, I just wanted to add that the palm scanning, the identification of the patient at the access point was where palm scanning evolved. But the point of care we've moved into that. And I have to say, our customers are becoming creative in approaching us in creating the workflows where they want to add in the palm scan at point of care. Chemotherapy is one of them. Radiology is another one of them. Giving blood transfusions is another one. So we're actually working with customers to enhance those workflows, and where does the palm scanner bring more value and optimize that patient safety.
Thanks, Claire. And both you and Chris have mentioned palm scanning and biometrics, and we're going to get into a little bit more detail about that in one or two more slides. I think there's just one more where there are a couple examples of consequences of misidentification that really have both financial and clinical impact. I know I've had conversations with you guys where it's not just one or the other, it's really both. And here are a couple examples. We hear about duplicates a lot, and it's sort of it's not a funny topic at all, but it's funny the way that people say, like, oh, duplicates? Oh, we have so many duplicates. We have such a problem with duplicates. So it's clearly a problem with some downstream effects. The middle of that slide talks about overlays, and I feel like that comes up a little bit less often, but as you both have explained to me, is a very challenging situation, especially to unwind. And Claire, you started to talk a little bit about who needs to be involved and who needs to be informed and to deal with some of these situations. So I wonder, before we get to, what can we do about these situations, if you would just talk a little bit more, especially about overlays, like what is an overlay, why is it so difficult to untangle, what are some of the impacts that overlays can have? Claire,
Sure.
Do you want to pick up on that one?
Sure, and the duplicates, while we don't want duplicates, it's safe to say, and I think we can all agree, that a duplicate medical record is safer than an overlay. There's risks involved with it, of course, but when you have an overlay and you start putting different records into medical records that you may never untangle. And, we know that facilities spend X amount of FTEs annually trying to match these duplicates, untangle these overlays, and it really is an endless task that there is no resolution. So the ideal is having that cleansed data from walking in the door, avoiding the duplicates, avoiding the overlays, and it goes on and on and on and on, from being in the emergency room to being admitted to discharge to invoicing to follow-up from companies like Press Ganey that do patient satisfaction. Press Ganey sending mail out to the wrong patient that never attended the facility. It is like a spider's web that is so entangled. And I know, Chris, the overlays, I know you have a very strong views and thoughts on the overlays.
Yeah, I think this is where patients get harmed, because, and I'll just give you an example of one that I had heard of. The patient got admitted. It was a simple gallbladder. They had really no medical history prior to that. And they came in and they said, okay, we're just going to have you get ready. You're going down for surgery, and then we're going to give you your morning meds. So they're like, okay, they figured this is the regime for this. Patient was medicated, getting ready for surgery, starts complaining of being very dizzy. And they're like, they take his pressure and it's 80 over palp, and they're like, what's going on? And they're like, well, was his blood pressure this morning? It was like, 130 over, normal. It was 130 over 70. And it was like, and they gave him a regular dose of blood pressure medications. And that's when the patient turns and says, I don't take blood pressure medications. And this is where one of those overlays it could have a very serious effect. So they delayed surgery, which again costs money for everybody, as well as time. Had to treat his hypotension, which is not something that you could just give fluid and wait it out. Again, you had to be aggressive about bringing his blood pressure and keeping him, a good blood pressure for peripheral reasons, and make sure that it's good perfusion. And this is all because someone's chart was mixed with someone else's chart, and it may never get caught. And this is the part we talk about. You know, it may be downstream 2 months and maybe in the medical records for a year. It isn't, this person didn't have a real big medical history, so when they came in for something which should have been simple as a gallbladder operation, they suffered a real hit when it came to medical care. This is something that they, you know, didn't have to endure if they had taken the time to know that this one was an overlay and to pull it apart. I do hear the other part of the other end from the medical records folks, not the clinician side, because they don't know that this is all happening behind the scenes. They like, this takes forever to pull apart. Claire said it sometimes you don't even get to the bottom of it. When we say it takes months and years, this could have been going on for a long time. And when is the patient's information different from the person who's coming into it? So you have to go back forensically and pull them apart day by day, visit by visit, to make sure that you get now 2 charts, not just 1, 2 charts correct as you exit it. So to me, it's just such a risk and safety concern to me. And it's great that, you know, we can stop duplicates and overlays, but from the safety standpoint, this is a safety issue to the core for me. And if you have a safety project that you can actually have a return on ROI, you can stop duplicates and overlays and take some of these people that are working on pulling them apart and putting them on other clinical issues and records issues, that's real. You can save a lot of money and really pay for this solution by doing the right thing safety-wise. So to me, it curbs that identity and theft and the fraud end of it. I mean, that's really great on that end of it. To me, you get safety out of it. That's not very often you can say you start a safety project and you end up with money in return. Typically, you start a safety project like, you know, hand washing. You put 5,000 Purells across the hospitals. Everyone's pumping in and pumping out. And it really doesn't cover a whole lot of the whole infectious control thing. Yet you spend thousands and millions of dollars in places. Here you spend less than that, and you get a safety feature that works. So to me, it's just a no-brainer.
Yeah. So thank you guys for taking us through, you know, some examples of the problems and the consequences, especially from a safety perspective. Now let's get into a little bit of a conversation about what one thing that can be done to address patient identification, and this has to do with biometrics. So what you're seeing here, or what we're looking at here, are some characteristics of biometrics that may be used for a healthcare organization to decide which biometric to use, but they also highlight some of the reasons why you would consider a biometric at all to deal with some of those challenges that start at registration. So there are benefits in terms of accuracy and permanency, who can use the technology, and will patients use the technology. So wanted to get a couple of your thoughts about, you know, why would a healthcare organization consider biometrics? And we can talk a little bit too about palm scanning, which was the biometric that you mentioned before as one of the biometrics. So Chris, why biometrics and why palm scanning?
Sure. Well, as I mentioned, biometrics is again that accuracy level. That's the point is that you get 100%. Your biometrics don't change from womb to death. You know, the vein pattern in your hand, all it is looking at the deoxygenated blood in your palm. It does not change from your entire life. So again, the accuracy is very good in regards to that. And fingerprints are accurate as well, but they sometimes have that connotation that someone's taking that image. And even though oftentimes when we store a fingerprint, you're storing it as an algorithm and you're really not storing the fingerprint itself, people are a little hesitant in putting their fingerprint down in this day and age. They think, you know, that why does your brother need my fingerprint? Unlike palm patents, they don't have any forensic value. There is no palm vein database. You know, you can't leave it at a crime scene. There's nothing that you can leave behind. It's not something that has that negative connotation. So I think to me, it's a little easier for the patients to digest. It's not like, again, Big Brother watching. As far as other things like, you know, iris scans or facial recognition, again, you're not staring into a camera. Again, people feel sometimes that that's a little bit invasive. So putting your palm down and getting I think to me is something that's, they know the accuracy is there. They know that they can get what they need for that scan and not have it be negative for them. So I think that's why they reach out for that biometric. Do you have any other concerns about some of the palm vein versus other forms, Claire?
No, I think the palm vein is the way forward. You talk to the iris scan, in which we have that capability, but I will tell you that, like a lot of things in this world, when you're one side of the table it looks great, but when you're on the other side actually with the patient, it's a very challenging option to go for. With the elderly, patients are sick, they don't want messing around with their eyes, the pediatric population. So it does have usage, but it has a limited usage. And I think that when you look at both of the options, you have to be real of the patient population and the clientele that you're actually serving. People see the iris and they associate it with coming through the airport, looking at the camera, take a picture and off you go with your eyes. Actually, with the iris, you have to lean onto the camera, it captures your eyes. It's straightforward, but when you're not feeling well, it's a challenge. So palm scan is definitely the easiest and the most convenient for the majority of patients.
Yeah, and I think one of the other things that we've talked about sometimes is that the situation of unresponsive or unconscious patients that may show up in the ED, where I know both of you have experience. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about both, why it's important to be able to identify people in the ED and know exactly who they are, as well as how our trauma search feature works with Patient Secure or the palm scanning. Krista, I'm going to start with you for that one.
Sure. So for folks on the call, just to let them know what our trauma search is, we label it that, but I always tell folks that it's more than that. Again, that's the name that we gave it. Unresponsive patients are something that we deal with, and Claire and I have both been in the ER for 20-plus years. We won't tell you how long. But it could be that stroke patient that can't verbalize anything, or someone who is confused and can't give you the right information. So, whether it's an Alzheimer's patient, whether it's someone who's suffering from a stroke, or again, intoxication, unconscious. These are real life scenarios that we typically will register them as a John Doe, and it's real. We have sometimes 4 or 5 John Does in there. If we have the capability to do a trauma search via this palm scan, we know if they've been enrolled before, we get their information. We'd be able to put their x-rays under their name so that it's future they can actually go back and look at the visit history, not have to merge them downstream, again, causing more work for another group. Certainly we'd be able to give them the right medications without any worries about allergies or, again, holding back any kind of treatment. Like I mentioned earlier, during an emergency room visit in a trauma situation, you're going to get a CAT scan pretty quickly. We oftentimes don't give it with IV dye because we don't know if people are allergic or not, because why? They're unconscious. If we knew they had that ability, they didn't have any allergy to IV dye, we might treat them differently, which is, again, now changing the course of patient care. So it's something that we want to make sure that, it's there as a resource. If you have people enrolled and you can use it, if it saves one person, then it's done great. I know that we have the example on the screen there that this is just in 1 year. They've enrolled over 31,000 folks. They've had over 61,000 authentications, which means they're using it pretty robustly, and they've had 45 trauma searches. Trauma searches, you don't need to know their date of birth and have them put the palm down. You can guesstimate their age and place their hand on the scanner, which is portable. You can put it right on top of them with a small 6 or 8 foot cord. So you can recreate it next to the patient and get the information that's really vital to treat them. So I think those having in that group, this is a small sampling of 30,000 and 60,000 authentications. They had 28 of those had successful scans, which means 28 of those people actually were identified when they were most crucial. So to me, that's a win, again, from a safety standpoint. And more importantly, from the patient standpoint, they got the right care. And there is no worry about, this person getting something happen to them, whether it be that simple chest x-ray or the wrong CAT scan. They get the right care, and that's important.
Claire, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think Chris covered it. I think one of the things to remember is if you move forward with palm scanning, the most logical and the most effective way of getting that trauma result that Chris talked about in the emergency department is increasing your database in a rapid fashion. So deploying your ambulatory environments where your patients are, it's a more controlled environment. Increase that database, and when they start showing up, or should they show up in the emergency room, they'll have been enrolled, and that's what allows them to be drawn into that trauma search and helps you identify that unidentified patient that Chris was talking about.
Right, right. So you both have been sharing with us a little bit today some of the clinical consequences with some financial ramifications as well. One of the things that we've experienced, I think, is that dealing with the problem of patient misidentification is really a multi-stakeholder effort. So there's a clinical piece, there's also a financial piece. Patient access may be involved because they are the registration staff at the front lines there of identifying patients and really the front lines of patient safety. And IT, also needs to be brought into the loop. So I wanted to get your thoughts about, if you're trying to engage multiple people at an organization to consider biometrics or consider a different way of identifying patients, how have you seen this to be effective or successful? So, Chris, do you have any thoughts about that one?
Yeah, I actually, I had been with the company now for about 5 years, and one of the first places I saw this being used was in a New York hospital, and I was actually in there, again, to Claire's point, their outpatient clinic, and it was a men's clinic. We were going there because they were going to start on their electronic prescribing pathway, and they wanted to do some, again, some walkthroughs and assess the situation. So I went in there and I looked over and I knew they had our patient secure palm scanners at their registration point. I was amazed at how they adopted it. So the patient access, they're like, "Hi, John." They knew them because they came in, but the first thing John did is put his palm down on the scanner. They're like, "Has anything changed?" No. They quickly said, "Okay, you're all set. Go and grab a seat. We'll have you back in 2 minutes." That changed that reg time that I know can take 6, 10, 20 minutes at times, waiting for patients to come back from the emergency department or in a waiting room, down to a 2-minute window. I mean, to me, that was enormous to see that. And that impacts everybody. So again, they know that, one, they check their medical records so that it's the right person. They check that if their insurance is changed, so it hits financial. It changes the access so they know that they're getting the right patient. And then clinically, you're going to get that patient back sooner. So, right away, you hit the first 3. And then as this goes through, you don't worry about the HIM or the IT part of it because it's the right record. So all the downstream effects that we talked about during this webinar doesn't happen. So you don't have to worry about the duplicate and overlay. So just simply seeing that in action, I was like, wow, like this is speeding people through the process. So to me, I saw all the stakeholders kind of get, a win in that. And the one part that we left out here that I mentioned earlier, the patient gets signed right in, gets quickly through the system, and again, gets good care.
Claire, would you like to add anything about how to engage different stakeholders in this kind of effort?
Yeah, historically, when you talk patient identity, patient access, it comes under that rev cycle environment, under the IT people, sometimes under HIM, but without a shadow of a doubt, and in all of the EZ facilities I've worked in over my career, and Chris has as well, when it's good and the patient's identified, they're seen, treated, discharged, inpatient, moved out, it's good. It's all patient access. But the minute there's a misidentification or there's any questioning about the patient's registration identity through that process, it involves clinical leadership. And Chris talked to it earlier. Morally, ethically, and legally, there has to be clinical involvement to iron out the creases of what went wrong, where it went wrong, and to correcting it as quickly as possible. So when you look at biometrics for identifying patients, for patient access, please, please, please bring your clinical leadership to the table, because I think I can speak very confidently that when there is a misidentification, it falls very heavily, usually starts with the charge nurse, the resource nurse, but that nurse leader, and then it is rolled up and ends up on the C-suite when results end up in the wrong patient chart. So it's pretty catastrophic, and clinical is always in the thick of it. So bring them to the table at the beginning, let them have a say, let them discuss what they see as the good, the bad, and the ugly in trying to implement biometrics.
Claire, I'd add one other thing. It's not always bring just one to the table. It's oftentimes bring multiple folks. As we talked about the stakeholders being kind of, benefits from each one, it also means that they actually kind of siloed. So sometimes if you're really thinking about this in your organization, you need to seek out, the right folks to bring to the table, not just clinical, because again, if clinical has the impact, may have to clean it up. Patient access has to bring them in and get them through the system. Finance has to deal with either the loss in revenue or not, or cleaning up a record. But no one, might not just own the whole project. So you do need to bring, 3 or 4 pieces of the puzzle together to get this. It's not simple. It's not one shop that you just knock on the door and this is where it's going to happen. There's so many stakeholders that you do need to think about bringing them together. So if you're thinking about bringing into your hospital, make sure that you're including these stakeholders, because they all going to benefit, again, and maybe not all want to take it as their project, but they're all going to have a piece of the pie. So it's to make sure you're including the right folks.
Yeah, thank you for that clarity, Chris. Bringing clinical to the table was an adjunct to those other stakeholders that you see on that screen. So thank you for that.
Well, and thank you both. We're getting ready to wrap up the webinar, but I want to pause for a second before we go to this last slide here to say that if anyone has any additional questions, feel free to type them in at the Q&A box, and we will have a look at them before we close. But on this last slide, both of you were just talking about benefits to multiple stakeholders. So this slide with the patient in the center kind of summarizes some of the benefits in different areas. So patient safety, revenue, patient satisfaction. So there's a number of items here, and I know we've covered a lot of them over the course of this webinar. I thought I would just ask you if there are any that you feel like we didn't cover that you may want to comment on right now before we close, or if there are any that really jump out as ones that you would want to highlight. So Chris, I'll give you another second to kind of look at the list and think about if there's anything that we didn't cover you want to add, or just drive home.
Sure. Thank you. You've heard me say it half a dozen or more times. To me, it's always about the safety, but I'm not going to underestimate some of the other benefits of it. One of the things that I'll point out is this identity theft and fraud. We've had a hospital that implemented it, and their proximity to the other hospital was probably about a mile. Not uncommon in a busy, metropolitan area. And they said that one of the things that the other hospital noted is they got an abundance of fraud slid down the street because they stopped going to someplace that they knew they were going to be stopped at that front door. And, something you don't measure that, as the hospital implements it, you just see clean records coming through. The other hospital certainly documented that they needed to now look at this product because they're getting a lot of this fraudulent attempts. So, Claire alluded to it earlier, whatever the reason is, whether, again, they don't have health care, their coverage isn't great, they're uninsured. There's reasons why people are trying to beat the system and be fraudulent. And that doesn't go away unless you put something in place that blocks them. And that's one of the things that I forget about all the time when we do it, because it goes away from the hospital that implements it. So you don't see that as a number that you ever track. But as it was very evident to the hospital down the street, they said we need to now get this because it's something that they were unaware of as well until they saw a spike in it. So I do think that there is things that do pop up like this. I mentioned that the revenue cycle overall, if you can get half of these returns back, you know, and save money on it, then you're doing the right thing as a safety project to me. Those are kind of my wrap-ups on those ones.
Mm-hmm. Claire, what are your last thoughts here about some of the benefits?
Yeah, I think it's all been covered through this webinar, Rebecca, but I think to drive home patient safety and for all the reasons that patients may present themselves as somebody else, we still want to catch that at the point of access because we want to make sure that those individuals primarily, A, still get their health care, but that we can channel them through the right resources of the facility that we're working at. So they get their care, that we have patient safety in place, we minimize our duplicates, take away our overlays, and it all comes back around to the patient safety. And thank you to everybody. And I'm actually just going to throw a perk out there, Rebecca. I see that we do have international attendees on this webinar today. I'm actually at the HIMSS show in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia. So if any of our international guests are nearby, we actually have patient secure here that we are very happy to demo because we know how difficult it is for our international customers.
Right. Thanks, Claire. Thank you very much for participating, considering your many hours time difference from us at the moment. And thanks, Chris, too. I appreciate you taking the time, and thank you all for joining our webinar today. I'll remind you that it has been recorded, so you will have a link to the webinar in a couple days, and we hope to see you again on one of our webinars. Thanks very much.